Welcome to the China Call podcast on the Fight, Laugh, Feast network. You can call me Missionary Ben for now. At some point, I might give up more of my secret names that I've used in China over the years. For now, Missionary Ben will have to work. You'll hear later in the podcast my pen name that I use as well. And so I was a missionary in China for about 14 years, and from the early 2000s until 2018, when I was deported from China, arrested, interrogated, and then deported from China about 6 years ago in May of 2018. And I moved to China first as a teenager, really. I visited when I was 18, turned 19 in China on a short-term trip to southeastern China. It was really, really hot those 2 weeks I was there. Me and my couple of teammates, we spent a lot of time running from the police, hiding in hot, humid conditions, trying to distribute Bibles and tracts in difficult places and areas, and lots of stories I could tell about that. But we survived and made it. I did not feel at the time like I was called to return and live in China. I went home and told the stories and said, wow, that was amazing. Maybe I'll go back again someday when I've forgotten how difficult and hard it was. And I didn't realize how quickly that would come about. And I don't think it was me personally as much as the Lord just really laying a burden on my heart for China. I went home, tried to start college. I had just graduated high school that spring, and was driving home one day from school, and just a week or so into college, and or a few days really, my truck broke down on the side of the interstate in Oklahoma, where I'm from, and it was hot August day, and then somebody could say, well, maybe you just got heat stroke and that's what did it. But no, something happened while I was just driving home and meditating on what I had just experienced in China, and the thought came to me that I can't be here. I've got to go back there. I've got to learn the language, and I've got to spend my life in whatever way I can ministering to the people there, the majority of whom have never heard the gospel. And it was so clear in my mind and so obvious what I should do that it was as if God spoke to me, but I didn't hear an audible voice or anything like that. But it was definitely a clear calling, a burden that I would say kind of fell on me at that moment. And within a few months, I had kind of quit what I was doing, quit school, and made plans to join and be an intern with the ministry in China for at least a year. That was 2003 was the full year that I then spent in China, and moved there in January of 2003 and spent that entire year there. The best thing I did that year in China was learning Chinese, and I didn't go into the year thinking that's the main thing I'm going to do, but it turned out to be the main thing that I did do is learn to speak and to read Chinese that year. I needed it to be able to share the gospel. I needed it to be able to get where I was going and to go different places. It was important for those reasons, obviously, but it was also important because not knowing the language and doing the things that we were sent to do by the ministry I was working with at the time, just not all of them were super helpful. Some of that was a little bit superfluous, a little bit unnecessary. And so I thought, well, at the very least, I can dive deep and learn the language, and I can begin speaking with the people and sharing the gospel and then kind of set a path for maybe the future in China. And so that led really into what became 15 years in China from 03 to 18. I wasn't there the entire time. We had trips in and out of China, obviously. I got married in 2004, the following year in Peru, moved to China with my young wife in the following year, and we were there and raised a family there and had our children there. I'm still kind of debating on how much of my personal details to give out here. I'm sure over time, if you listen to these podcasts, you'll catch glimpses here and there of our family and whatnot. But just for safety reasons, I'd rather not have my real identity and all the details of who we are and identifying details recorded and published publicly for all the world to hear. Not so much for the sake of the Christians, they'll be interested to hear that, but I still hope to get back into China someday. And so again, I'm kind of playing with fire a little bit here and just trying to see how much I want to actually share about myself. But I did learn Chinese that first year, and traveled all over China. I think that first year I counted at the end of the year 120 cities that I had visited that particular year. 120 cities, I mean, small, some big, capital cities, major cities, probably 20 something Chinese provinces out of 30 or more that there are. And but again, I learned Chinese by speaking with the people, by being on the ground, by talking and listening to the people. And I used a Bible, and I used maps that I had with me. I had a little phrase book and a dictionary, and I learned it the hard way. Didn't have apps back then. I didn't even have a cell phone for part of that time, and taught myself again the hard way, looking up words in the dictionary, which is a whole different deal. How do you look up a Chinese word in a dictionary? They don't have letters like we do. They do have a way to look up words using what they call radicals. If you're familiar at all with Chinese, you'll understand how that works quite a bit. And so again, China was, after spending and investing that year in China, it was obvious to me that God had called me there, and that I hadn't invested that year of really digging into the language and learning the Chinese language and traveling the country and learning about the culture and people and all these things. It wasn't for nothing. It wasn't just a temporary thing. It was something that I wanted to pour my life into, and it was a purpose and a big deal. And I wanted to be able to share Jesus in some way with the people there. And I was young and immature in many ways, but I was mature enough to know that this was something that few people were able to do, and that is learn Chinese well. And I didn't want to waste that gift that God had given and the opportunities He had opened up to me there. And so that's a quick overview of kind of my China bona fides, I guess. And there's more I'm sure I'll share at some point. But so visited China for the first time in 2002, short-term trip, moved there in 2003, lived there for a full year, came home, got married the following year, moved back to China, and ended up settling in Northwest China with my wife. And we had our children, raised our family there in Northwest China. And that's primarily where we served for many, many years, was Northwestern China. And I'll mention the names of the places later. What I'm going to do now in this particular podcast, things are a little out of order here from what they'll be probably down the line. I'm working on a book. I guess you could call it. It's nothing like a book yet. It's just a list of things I want to talk about. But it's going to be called China Compass, which is the name of the podcast as well. Common questions about communist China. That's kind of the working subtitle there. And what I want to do is, over the years, I've gotten so many questions from people that have heard me speak in churches or give talks on China and missions. I've gotten many, many, many questions. And many of them have been repeat questions. So over and over again, you hear the same questions over again. And what I want to do in this little book that I'm working on this year and in the podcast is work through these questions and just give answers so they can be recorded. And again, they're common questions that I hear. Some of them are questions that I wish people would ask and don't. But then there's a lot that I have heard over and over again, and I just want to have a definitive answer and have it in a place where people can access it, whether it's on the podcast or whether it's in the book that hopefully will come out later this fall. So today, though, I want to work through 5 or 6 really basic questions about China as an introduction to what will come later. In the upcoming podcast, we'll go through a list of questions about the Chinese church, the church in China, the Chinese people, Chinese language, and then so on and so forth. So the questions are divided up into subheadings in that way. But these introductory questions are meant just to help you, in case you know nothing at all about China, just to have a little bit more information about the country and what we're dealing with when we talk about China. So, number 1, introductory question: what does China's name even mean? What does China mean? Well, the Chinese people don't call their country China; they call it 中国. 中国is the Chinese word. It's spelled in our way of spelling ZHONG, 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 GUO, 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 and it literally translates to be middle country, middle nation, or middle kingdom is probably the best way to put it. Middle kingdom, and it just, I think the name goes to show that China has for so long been a huge influence in the world. And they see themselves really historically as the center of the world, like the big deal in the world. And you can still see that today. Our maps of the world show the U.S. and our American maps at least show the U.S. and North America being in the center of the world map. And well, China's map showed China being in the center, and North and South America are way off to the right of the map, with the Pacific Ocean on that side. And China, you can see the way they interject themselves into politics and in every other country in the world, all the different things that are going on. They really do see themselves as being the center of it all. And you get that feeling when you're there. You really do. When you live there that long, you kind of switch your internal geographic point, and you start feeling like this really is the middle of everything. There's so many people. The population is so large, and then in Greater Asia, there's so many more people. If you just look at the heat map of number of people in the world, Asia is the center of the world if you look at it in that way as far as population goes. And North and South America are relatively remote in that sense, although we have outsized importance based on economy and all these other things. So China's name just means Middle Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom. Interestingly enough, the Chinese name for America is Meiguo, which literally translates to be beautiful country, beautiful kingdom. That's the name they give to America. Now, the reason they chose that word for America is it kind of sounds like America, that M sound, M-E sound, May, America. But Chinese people do think of America as being a country kind of flowing with milk and honey, just a beautiful place and lots of green and lots of trees and just mountains. They do see it that way. And I've talked to many Chinese early on in my time there that they didn't necessarily realize how they were being influenced by the name, but they would say, America, Meiguo, and they'd say, such a beautiful country. And they would just repeat that word over again, basically. Beautiful country, what a beautiful country. And they didn't realize. And I would have to tell them sometimes, well, yeah, it's pretty. There's a lot of beautiful places, but we also have crime and poverty and ugly places too, nasty looking city blocks and different places that aren't so nice. And so, yeah, I had to kind of help them see clearly through that. Next question, just how big is China? Just how big is China? I don't have the numbers here. I don't have the exact, how many million square miles or whatever it is. But just to give you an idea, China is slightly larger geographically than America is. It's smaller, obviously, than Canada and Russia, but I think it comes in third in actual size, so slightly larger than America. And that's including Alaska and Hawaii, which Alaska adds a big chunk to our American geography as well. So China's a big place, big nation, and it's an odd shape. And the West is really, really massive, the western provinces of China. And then the Northeast actually is deceptively large as well. There's a big province up there called Heilongjiang, Black Dragon River, that stretches up quite far up into southern Siberia as well. So China's a big country. How big is China? Again, bigger than the U.S., large, slightly bigger, really large country. The basic geography of China, that's the next question. I've already kind of touched on that. China's geography, the West is generally dry and arid and mountainous as well, deserts and dry, so somewhat similar to the U.S. as far as that goes, although China's West does not have a coast like America does. So mountains in the West and arid. The center part of the country is really mountainous. South central China is really, really mountainous, but a lot of people still living there. And then if you go further east, it becomes more fertile farmland. There's still mountains all scattered throughout the whole country, but the vast majority of China's people live in the eastern third of the country. And very few, relatively speaking, live in the far west, in the places of China that would be more like Nevada or Utah or Wyoming or Montana here in America. And so China's geography is, again, similar to the U.S. in that sense, where most people live in the east, big open spaces in the west. Even China's people groups, the Tibetan peoples and the Mongolian peoples and the Muslim peoples mostly live in the far west, kind of like in America. We have a lot of the Native Americans living in the west. So there are some similarities in that way. So China's basic geography is that the capital, Beijing, is in the north central part of the country. Shanghai, the financial capital, is on the eastern seaboard, right about where Norfolk, Virginia would be in America. And then Hong Kong is in the far south. Really, if it was overlaid over America, Hong Kong would be way down in the Caribbean somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, pretty far south. China sits a little further south than the U.S. does in relation to the equator as well. How many people live in China? China really debates this number. They want that for years and years. They wanted to be the most populous country in the world. So they got up to 1.4 billion people in the last few years, and India has caught up with them. And so just in the last year, I've seen some articles talking about how India probably has beaten China, has passed China in that population race. And because China most likely is overinflating their population. And so it's more than likely in the 1,300,000,000-ish range. And India is probably actually a little more by this point. But it's a lot of people. And even though China's a big country, that's still a lot of people packed into a relatively small place. But it's interesting when you're there, you don't feel like China is just completely full of people. There are lots of open spaces, lots of mountains, lots of farmland. But there are people literally everywhere. It's hard to find any place, any mile square that doesn't have somebody living. Even in the far west, in the Tibetan Plateau and the deserts of the far west, you do have large towns and cities and villages lining the rivers and in the valleys as well. And so you have people literally living everywhere all over China. You can be in the mountains. I've been in the mountains of Western China climbing and hiking, and it doesn't shock you just to see some random villager walk out of the woods, in the middle of nowhere, and he's just picking berries or picking mushrooms or whatever it is, and he lives in a village a few miles down the valley, and so you just don't think anything about that. Just seeing people everywhere, it's hard to really get beyond the people in China. There's so many there, and they spread out way up into all the crevices of all the valleys, all into the hinterlands of the country. And so there's people everywhere, which is one reason why we feel called to serve there. So many people, so many opportunities, so many people that need the gospel, that need to hear about Jesus still a lot of unreached peoples in China. So the fifth introductory question is, what languages are spoken in China? Now, I said that on purpose, what languages, because a lot of people just assume China is one language, Chinese, right? Mandarin, maybe you might know that word, Mandarin Chinese. But China really does have hundreds of dialects, dozens and dozens of different languages that are spoken. But primarily, it's true. The main language is Mandarin Chinese, is spoken and taught throughout the country. Most people speak it, even if they speak a second or third language in their home, they still will at least understand Mandarin and probably speak it to some extent. They won't speak it very well necessarily. In the rural, remote areas, they'll speak their local dialect much more fluently, but they will speak Mandarin or understand it from the TV propaganda and stuff that comes across the radio and TV as well. So the second largest language, well, I was going to say Cantonese, and it probably is. It's the most well-known besides Mandarin, Cantonese, but there are some other regional dialects that are spoken probably by more people than speak Cantonese, although that's debatable. I don't have the numbers here with me. Shanghai dialect is big. The southern dialect, the Zhuang dialect of south central China is a massive dialect spoken by 10 or more million people there. Even the Uyghur people, we've heard about the Uyghurs in the news and how they're being persecuted by the Chinese in the far west. Even the Uyghurs number almost 10 million in China. So there are many languages in China that are spoken by millions and millions of people. But like I mentioned a minute ago, the villagers often will not speak really good Mandarin. So if you learn Chinese and learn Mandarin and speak decent, it's really common for them to meet you and hear you speak, and then them to say, "Wow, your Chinese is better than ours. Your Chinese is better than ours." And at first you think, "What are you talking about? You're from here. How's our Chinese better than your Chinese?" What they mean by that is you sound like you've learned the proper dialect of Chinese. You speak Mandarin properly, and we don't speak it properly. We speak it with our own regional accent, and our dialect kind of messes with it. That's what they mean by that. It doesn't mean your vocabulary is better than theirs. It doesn't mean that. It means maybe your pronunciation, at least in the basic things, is better than their pronunciation. And so, anyway, those are the 5 introductory questions about China. I'm sure there's more I could dive into there. We're going to get to all the other questions, though, in upcoming podcasts as we go through different topics there. I want to stop and just say the China Compass podcast is brought to you by Pray for China. Pray for China is a partner ministry with China Compass. It's a ministry that we have, and it's really exists to promote prayer for China. Obviously, Pray for China. it's a simple concept, and I've already mentioned a little bit about China's geography, and I've on purpose mentioned a few of the things that China has in common with the U.S. geographically. More people in the east, less people in the west. Some of the similarities in those things. What we've done with Pray for China is a couple years ago, I took time and I matched up every province in China with a U.S. state or multiple states to be able to match up properly, so that we can pray for China a little more strategically, a little more specifically than just random, just big prayers. Lord, save China. We can pray specifically for a province, and we can adopt a province if you want to use those terms. Each state can adopt a province. This all started, by the way, in my home state of Oklahoma, where I'm from. Oklahoma and its adopted province, Gansu province, is literally has been sister states with Oklahoma for about 40 years. Our governor, back in 1985, traveled to Gansu and signed a friendship accord with Gansu province government. And there's a friendship tree that was planted, and it's been this partnership for 40 years. Nothing real crazy. They've had some back and forth visits between different people from the two. I didn't even know this until after I'd lived in Gansu for multiple years. I had no idea that there was this relationship between my home state and Gansu province. And when we found out about that, I said, Lord, you can use this to raise up people from my home state, churches and believers, to pray for Gansu and intercede for them. And maybe we'll send teams there someday from here as well. And so that's where the idea began, is matching up my home state with Gansu province. So I took it one step further and matched up all the counties in Oklahoma with all the counties in Gansu province. And then I when people really seemed to respond well to that idea here in Oklahoma, I took time to match up all the surrounding states with other Chinese provinces, and then I moved on and until I matched up the whole country, the U.S. So every state in the U.S. has a Chinese province to adopt for prayer. And you can go to prayforchina.us. That's pray, F-O-R, China, not the number, but the word for, prayforchina.us. You can click on the map and you can click on your state and you can see which province to pray for. And there's not a whole lot. There is some information you can learn about that province, but it's not like there's just pages and pages of information. The idea is that if you really do adopt that province, you'll take the time to Google the name, Google names of the leaders, Google news stories from that province, and you can keep up on your own and find ways to pray for that province on your own. That's our hope. And so I'll be talking more about Pray for China, I'm sure, almost every podcast. And so just as an example, I mentioned earlier, Pray for China, Oklahoma's matched up with Gansu province. China's western provinces are so large and so massive that it takes multiple states to match up with just one of China's western provinces. So for instance, Tibet, the province of Tibet in southwest China, we'll talk about Tibet in a future podcast about how that works, and Tibet's not its own country, it's a province and what that all means. But Tibet, just to match up properly, it's matched up with, if I can get this right in my head, all of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and then the northern half of Utah and Colorado. All of that is matched up with Tibet to get a proper match with Tibet in China to pray for. So if you're in one of those places, Tibet is your province to adopt for prayer. And you can see there's some similarities there as far as being the mountain states in the U.S. and the roof of the world in China, Tibet as well. So China Compass is brought to you by Pray for China, prayforchina.us. Please pray for China, and we'll talk more in the coming. What we're actually going to do, and I'll also go ahead and say that we're going to look at one province each week. We'll go through all the provinces, Lord willing, by the end of this calendar year. Each week we'll look at a particular province and go a little deeper into those provinces, and I'll tell you who it's matched up with to pray for here in the U.S. And so we'll do one a week. But first, today, as kind of an introductory podcast, an introduction, I'm going to do a 3-for-1. And these are the three territories, the three special administrative regions that really are not provinces in and of themselves, but they are places that you would have heard of at some point. And I want to explain a little bit about them. And a couple of them actually are matched up as well with some place to pray for. So I'm going to talk about Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau for just a few minutes. Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. First, we'll deal with Taiwan because it's really, China claims it as one of their provinces, their renegade province, and it's really not. It functions as its own nation, although they're ostracized by the world. Even they're not even part of the United Nations anymore, although they were one of the founding members. China's bullied everyone in the world to really try not to recognize Taiwan officially, and so Taiwan doesn't have embassies in the vast majority of countries in the world. They're just not allowed to. China would pull out if Taiwan had an embassy in those nations. So Taiwan does function, though, as its own nation there, just off the southeast coast of China. It's a relatively small island. The island, I just looked it up, it's a little larger than the state of Maryland. I say small, it's a large place, but it's not like a huge nation. A little larger than Maryland. It's got 24 million people, though, so very heavily populated, considering that most of the island is mountains. It's a big mountain range there, so a lot of people packed into a relatively small geographic area. There is some danger looking forward of China, threatening to take Taiwan back over. I'm a little bit skeptical on how serious that is. China doesn't. They want Taiwan back, but they want it peacefully. They want to be seen. They don't want to be seen as an aggressor in that way. That being said, there are scenarios where China might go after Taiwan aggressively at some point. I don't think so. I think they're willing to play the long game and win Taiwan back through some sort of trickery or what they would call diplomacy, but some sort of trickery over the years, or using other leverage rather than actual physical. We're going to go and just bomb them to smithereens. So I don't think that last scenario will happen. Hope not. But I do think China is not going to give up easily on the idea that Taiwan is part of their territory. I visited Taiwan really just once or twice, just flew through there, had layovers there. I think my first flight to Asia at all, way back in 2002, I was just, 18 at the time, had a layover there. I left the airport, but the airport's far outside the city, looked at the sky, saw the lights of Taipei in the distance, and thought, I've been to Taiwan. And I went back in the airport and caught my flight to Hong Kong a few hours later. That was really my only experience personally in Taiwan, was that long layover there. Now, Hong Kong is the next country on the list here. Hong Kong, everyone's heard of Hong Kong, I'm sure. It's a small group of islands and peninsulas on China's far southern coast. 7 million people packed into a really, really small livable area there. Hong Kong was originally, a territory of England for many, many years. England signed a treaty with China to give it back over in, I think it was 1997 that they turned it back over to China. Some people question they shouldn't have done that, but they really didn't have a choice. China would have thrown a big fuss, or maybe even gone to war, I think, at that point, to keep or to have Hong Kong become back as part of their territory. But for many years, it still functioned the same. And even to this day, if you go to Hong Kong, it does feel like you're going to a different country, different passport, different currency, different culture than China. All that's changing. A lot of mainland Chinese people now living in Hong Kong, and more people than ever speaking Mandarin in Hong Kong, even though it's mostly a Cantonese-speaking country. I landed in Hong Kong, my first visit to China. I remember getting there and taking the train from the airport to the ferry terminal, because I was traveling over that same night by boat to Macau, which is I'm going to talk about next here in a minute. And so from Taiwan, I remember it being so hot. It was August. I came out of the terminal, and it was just, it was like 100 degrees. It felt like, in just 100% humidity. And I was just blown away. I felt like walking through an oven in Hong Kong. And then that was my first experience. Over the years, I got to visit many, many, many times. Hong Kong feels like a second home to me in many ways. Spent a few months living there early on, and don't speak Cantonese much, but I do feel very much at home in Hong Kong. It's sad to see what's happened these last 4 or 5 years, because it has changed a bit. Hong Kong used to feel like a place you can really be free. You could say whatever you wanted. Whatever you couldn't do in mainland China, you could do in Hong Kong, and you were free there. They couldn't get you there. And at least that's what it felt like back in the day. And now that's just not the case. You've really got to watch yourself in Hong Kong. Not quite to the extent of mainland China, but at least to a point. And so Hong Kong, interestingly enough, the name Hong Kong, if you translate it from Cantonese, which is more the Hong Kong name is from Cantonese, to Mandarin, it's translated as Xianggang. And that literally, my Chinese accent, by the way, sounds really bad right now. I haven't spoken Chinese in a while. Xianggang literally translates as fragrant port or rich port. And I like to share this because it's kind of fun. So fragrant port or rich port, rich in the sense of like fragrant, not necessarily money, although it can also have that kind of meaning behind it. But if you translate that another time from English then into Spanish, what do you get? You get Puerto Rico, rich port, Puerto Rico. And so Hong Kong, loosely translated, could be Puerto Rico. And so in our Pray for China scheme, we have matched up Hong Kong and Puerto Rico. So it makes sense name-wise. It makes sense in the sense that Puerto Rico's not really a state, it's a territory. Hong Kong's not really China, but it is kind of part of China. And so there are some similarities there. So if you're from Puerto Rico listening to this, pray for Hong Kong, intercede for that nation and for the churches that are there, that they might remain faithful, and that Hong Kong might still be a light to China, as it has been for many, many years, that light wouldn't be snuffed out. Thirdly, I want to mention Macau. Macau is really the one of these three that's the most close to me personally. I spent a lot of time in Macau. My very first night in Asia, I made it all the way to Macau that first night. My very first experience is walking the streets of Asia and seeing the people and the sights was in Macau, just down below the apartment we stayed in there. I've been back many times over the years. Just as recently as last fall, I was there with my family. And it's a beautiful place, stark place. It's the most crowded city in the whole world. Some people say it's a small peninsula, just a few square kilometers, few square miles, but it's home to over 500,000 people just piled into that small area. Probably half the land mass in Macau is reclaimed land from the ocean, so it's more land now than there used to be. It's got a lot of history, including Christian history. Robert Morrison, the first Protestant missionary to China, is buried there and lived there off and on a couple hundred years ago. And so it's an amazing place. It's known really primarily by the world as Asia's Las Vegas. It's full of casinos. Beautiful casinos in some ways, but it's also a very sinful place. Obviously, a lot of greed, a lot of other things that go along with the casino industry are there. A lot of Chinese people come there to gamble. It's kind of China's. I'm going to use the word vaccine. They don't allow gambling in China proper, but they do allow an outlet for those Chinese people love to gamble. And so they allow an outlet for it in one place so they can try to control it there and try to manage it there. And so like an inoculation, if you will, to allow a little bit of an outlet for that gambling tendency that China does have. And so they funnel it all through Macau. So Macau's changed a lot since I was there for the first time 20-something years ago, but not completely changed. It's so I still love visiting there. It's really a needy place. Out of these three, out of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau, Macau is spiritually the most unreached still. The percentage of professing Christians is probably below 1%. There are some Catholics there, but most of them are kind of nominal. And but as far as evangelical Christian, it's just a very, very small percentage there. A lot of Buddhism still, a lot of obviously secularism and people just addicted to living for money in the world and whatnot. Even Buddhism really isn't religious as much as it is just kind of a way of life. And a lot of people who are Buddhist are also just their idols are themselves and money and being wealthy and famous, whatever that comes along with that. And so there you go. Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau, those are real brief. At some point, we'll come back probably once we finish the other provinces of China, and we'll look a little deeper at each one of those. But that's just kind of a quick overview of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau, which are the three kind of outlying territories of China. There are a few others I could maybe list, but I won't get into that now. Those are the main ones for sure. I want to make sure and tell at least one story each week. I've mentioned a few small things so far. I do want to mention, we're talking about these places of China and talking about my first short time in China, is I want to mention this. I survived the Sars pandemic in China. My first few months living in southern China just happened to match up with the outbreak of Sars. And so I was actually traveling in the center part of China when Sars first appeared on the scene, but I was not connected. I was getting online every now and then just through internet cafes, internet bars, and no cell phone connection at that time. And so I didn't even know that when my passport was stolen from me in March of 2003 in central China in Hubei province. And I ended up traveling for 2 weeks without a passport, made it down to southern China to the Chinese or the American embassy in Guangzhou, Canton. And I did not realize until much, much later that the day that I arrived there and applied for an emergency replacement passport was the day they evacuated almost all the people from the U.S. Embassy in Guangzhou that day because of the SARS outbreak in, this would have been April now of 2003. So I ended up stumbling right into the middle of the SARS outbreak there. It didn't seem that bad at first, and then things really got locked down for about a month or so. And I say locked down, the whole time, this is what was so weird about the more recent pandemic, is that in SARS, they never shut the borders, and they never forbade you to go outside and go places. Now, people would tell you, don't do it. Everyone's scared that you're going to die. You're going to have something happen. And the statistics from SARS were more lethal. I think overall, officially, the death toll was about 10%. 10% of those who got SARS died from it. So that was, but the overall numbers were way, way down from what I think confirmed cases. I'm looking here, 8,096 confirmed cases, 774 confirmed deaths, and it touched about 30 countries around the world, but primarily was China and South China and Asia in those areas. So it wasn't as virulent, but it was very lethal. And so people didn't want to go out. So there was about 45 days that I remember spending in our ministry base in Macau. There were 45 days that I slept in the same bed. And that was the longest I stayed in any one place that whole year, were those 45 days where I spent every night in Macau in our ministry apartment there. I did take one day trip, I remember, back up into China. And that was the only time during the whole SARS outbreak that I attempted to wear a mask. And nobody was forcing you to do it, but everyone said, you need to wear a mask. You need to wear a mask. Chinese people were all wearing masks at that time, which is more common in Asia anyway with the pollution and whatnot. And I remember I put the mask on for about 30 minutes walking the streets of Guangzhou, and I couldn't breathe back then, just like I couldn't breathe during COVID a few years ago either. Didn't like it, couldn't breathe. I said, you know what, forget this. Took it off and went without the mask for the rest of the day. Obviously, I didn't get SARS, and the numbers were, again, relatively small compared to other outbreaks that we've seen more recently as far as how widely it spread. But I do remember all the borders between all these countries. So when you're in Hong Kong and you're in Macau and you're in China, you cross borders, like international borders between those places. So if in one day you could cross borders 3, 4, 5 times if you're bouncing back and forth by ferry, by bus between these places. And starting with SARS, and then for almost the whole rest of the year, they didn't take it away. Kind of like how masks started and then it's hard to stop it, and lockdowns began and it was hard to stop it. Well, they started making you fill out these health questionnaires going in and out of these borders, crossing the borders. So every time you leave a place, leave Macau, you'd fill out a health questionnaire, and you'd enter China, you'd fill out a health questionnaire, and then you'd come back through and you'd fill one out going both directions. And then it had these temperature scanners that would scan your temperature as you'd walk through the border. And those didn't go away for the entire year. And so I got to where I was pretty quick at it, but you'd fill out these health questionnaires so fast, and then you'd go through the scanners hoping that your temperature wasn't elevated for some random reason, because you'd get pulled aside and get talked to, and hopefully not quarantined. But that was always a risk during that time as well. So that was kind of a foreshadowing of what came with COVID. You know, they didn't close the borders, but they did kind of force you to go through these different loops and these different things, these different activities that they wanted to make sure. Now, of course, if you really were running a fever, or if you really had coughed, the form would say, have you coughed in the last, 72 hours or whatever it is. Well, maybe I did. I'm not going to tell them I did, but maybe I did, right? Have you coughed? Have you had a runny nose? All these things. You just check all the boxes. No. Sign your name, sign the date, and off you'd go. But then they'd have a temperature thing to make sure that they wouldn't, that you weren't actually running a fever. So I'm going to talk more about SARS in the next podcast as well, and what it looked like on the mainland. This is what I've described now was more along the border areas, and I'll mention more what it was like being in Gansu during the aftermath of SARS and what they did in the mainland to try to keep SARS from spreading. It was a wild experience being in the mainland during the aftermath and kind of the waning period of SARS. But that'll be in the next podcast. So one other resource I want to mention as we bring this to a close, there's a book called Borden of Yale. Borden of Yale is about William Borden. William Borden is famous for the phrases "no reserve," "no retreat," "no regrets." He was a young missionary who didn't make it to the field, died young on his way to China. I'm the editor of a new edition of his famous book, Borden of Yale. It was written by not his, but Hudson Taylor's daughter-in-law. Hudson Taylor's daughter-in-law, Mrs. Howard Taylor, wrote Borden of Yale in 1926. And it was never really republished. And so we worked on a new edition with Aneko Press, is the publisher. Came out earlier this year. It's a beautiful book and tells an amazing story of a young man who was called to China just like I was. He never made it, though, to China. He visited as a young man once briefly, but never made it there to live there. And so I was privileged to be able to write the introduction to the book and be the editor and add a lot of footnotes to the story. So if you want a little bit of an introduction to China from 100 years ago, there is a section in Borden of Yale that you can read about China and his experiences visiting there many, many years ago. He actually talks about Hong Kong and Guangzhou, southern China as well. BordenofYale.com. You can get the book there, and you can also link from there to the Amazon page. So I do encourage you to get the book. You can get it, I think it's even free on Kindle from the publisher, and then you can buy the physical copy of the book. And highly recommend that book, and not just because I wrote the introduction and did most of the editing for it, but it's a beautiful story of a young man who was dedicated to missions and to China. So one last thing. This podcast, China Compass, is hosted by and is on the Fight Laugh Feast network. And there's a conference coming up later this year. God the Father is waiting and looking down the road for all his prodigal sons to return. Will prodigal America return to the Father in repentance, confessing that Jesus Christ is Lord, or will we fall to our own destruction? Will we fall like China fell many, many years ago and become a pillar of salt as a memorial for other nations? Join us on Reformation Weekend, October 31st to November 2nd in Fort Worth, Texas, for Prodigal America, the annual Fight Laugh Feast conference. You'll spend the weekend hearing from George Grant, Dusty Deaver, Steve Dace, James White, Douglas Wilson, and more, singing psalms and feasting and hopefully learning to fight. ProdigalAmerica.com is the website, ProdigalAmerica.com. I will be there, Lord willing, and I'm looking forward to it. And I'm going to try to hold off now on sharing my thoughts about comparing America and China and where we might be headed someday if things continue the way they are. So let's pray that America would indeed repent. Thank you for listening to the China Compass podcast on the Fight Laugh Feast Network. We'll see you next time.